death, tragedy, reconstruction, deconstruction, sadness, and regret. A cautionary tale, to put it simply, is a story with the message of warning the viewer of a specific danger. This could be the danger of greed, pride, love, revenge, bounty, and a million different other things. And with that logic, a cautionary character is simply someone whose own individual story serves as a cautionary tale. We see this type of characters pop up throughout all sorts of media, with some of the most famous examples being Anakin Skywalker, Walter White, Light Yagami, and more recently with characters like Eren Yeager and Franklin Saint. And let me tell you something, I absolutely adore these characters. These dark transitions they always have seem so raw and personal to me. I relate to them, sympathize with them, empathize with them, to the point that when an opposing opinion comes, condemning them, it's almost as if a natural instinct in me comes to defend them, even as horrible as they are. He's bad because he killed all of humanity. Shut the f*** up, you rat piece of b***. Don't you dare judge them. That's my son. That's my daughter. That's my Pookie Bear. Okay, I got a little bit too deep into that. And this feeling seems to intensify by 1000% when that character is the very center of the story, the main character, which is what we're focusing on in today's video. Seeing the story through their eyes creates a sense of closeness and understanding for these characters that goes far beyond what you would usually get with the villains or side characters. I'd even go as far as to argue that we relate to their struggle more than you would with your typical hero main character. But rather than overcoming it, they submit to it, embrace it, and in the end, simply become slaves to it. I think seeing them devolve in what feels like real time brings out the worst part of us, but in the best possible way. Something that a part of us wants but can never fully realize because, we're not psychopaths. But it's for that reason that when it reaches the point when they are clearly too far gone, there becomes a divide within the audience. Some are able to let these characters go and appreciate them for what they are, whilst others simply can't make that distinction, never leaving the irrational defense they feel towards the character. However, I'd argue that the opposing side of that can be even worse, as some people condemn these characters so harshly, completely denying the relatability aspect of these characters, denying arguably the most important aspect of a cautionary character, which is something I'll get into later in the video. And this is why these characters are so controversial. Once again, you see this especially after the ending of these stories, as it's very common to see criticisms like, Light should have won, I hate Skylar, or Eren should have done the rumbling, or the complete opposite, that they should have got a much harsher and brutal fate. And the most important aspect of this is that in the end, we have a lot of people overlooking the cautionary and simultaneously beautiful message presented in these stories, instead viewing it as a personal attack on their own feelings and values. And you know what? I think that's a real shame. And this brings me on to the reason why I wanted to make this video. Today I'm going to be looking at the numerous cautionary characters we've had over the years in an attempt to dissect what exactly a cautionary character is. Looking at where they stem from, the mask they use, parallel they always seem to have, the slave, and the problem with them. And by the end of the video, I can promise you a newfound understanding and appreciation for these characters and the hidden beauty that you can find within them. All for the sake of trying to make our experience of stories more fun, productive, and most importantly, meaningful. And to do this, I'd like to go all the way back to the creation of these characters. The author. I think the beauty of stories is that it's an extension of the artist's soul, and by far the most interesting scenarios I've come across is an author talking about a cautionary character they've created. George Lucas talking about how a huge part of Anakin's character stems from the part of humans that refuse to let go of things, the part that fears letting go of things. Or Stephen Knight, who talks about how a big part of Tommy Shelby's character stems from the nihilistic part of humans that form throughout their life, especially after experiencing trauma. Now, in making this video, I looked at numerous examples of authors and their own unique description of these characters. Now, what's really interesting here is the common thing that I found between all of these descriptions. The author always writes these characters to be the worst part of themselves, a part that they want to see come to light and at the same time get rid of. One case I find more interesting than the rest, maybe a little biased because I do love this story so much, is Hajime Isayama, the creator of one of the most impactful series of the last 15 years, Attack on Titan. In an interview with the New York Times, Hajime Isayama said explicitly that Eren is the worst part of himself, and that the story of Attack on Titan was about getting rid of that part of himself. Now, based on that statement alone, you might not find it that intriguing, but I think this thought becomes a lot more interesting when you look at the author's life and link it to the character. And trust me, it gets a lot more raw, like really, really raw. Raw! Isayama grew up in the rural part of Hita City, surrounded by huge walls with a desire to always leave his village and see more, very similar to the ambitions of Eren and Armin at the start of the series prior to this big bastard pulling up. Eventually he did leave the village to pursue his mangaka dreams, where he quickly found success, with his first ever manga becoming a huge success, Attack on Titan. A feat that is beyond insane when you take into account that most popular mangaka had a lot of failed attempts before getting a complete serialization, let alone it being as popular as Attack on Titan. And with that, Isayama has expressed numerous times over the years just how grateful he is for this. I think the somewhat positive outlook he has is reflected when he talks about how at the first half of this manga he related heavily to Armin, somebody whose entire character is based around hope, curiosity, and optimism. However, just as he said, this all changed when we entered the third core of the manga, and the outside world was revealed to be a lot worse than the inside. Like, a lot worse. A very disappointing reality for young Eren, and it was here a deep desire was born, to simply wipe it all away, erasing it from existence. I think it's clear to see what the worst part of Isayama was, a deep disappointment of the world and an underlying desire to simply erase it all away, a desire to destroy everything. In an interview with the Fullmetal Alchemist author, Hiromu Arakawa in 2021, Isayama mentions this deep desire to destroy everything, and probably a little bit freaked out, she responds by asking him a question. As an author, does your work reflect your self-worth? And in response he says that, I think it reflects my personal desire to express myself through destroying things. I'm not talking about destroying civilization or annihilating mankind, but turning the world upside down. And I think with that context, one of my favourite moments, not just in the series but of all time, becomes even better, becomes even darker, and becomes even more personal. Eren apologising to a child that he knows he's going to kill in the future. I'm sorry. I'm sorry. You see, it's to save the island, to save Eldia. But it's more than that. The reality of life beyond the walls was nothing like the world I dreamed about. It was nothing like the world I'd seen in Armin's book. When I learned that humanity had survived beyond the walls, I was so disappointed. And so, deep in my heart, I made a wish. I wished for it to all be wiped away. I'm sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm sorry. To me, it seems like Isayama's talking to himself here, more than he's talking to the viewer. His disappointment with the cruelty of mankind, the pressure, the workload, and his own personal suffering gives birth to, once again, a desire to wipe it all away. In an interview with the director of the 4th season of the anime, Hayashi, he talked about how Isayama specifically instructed him to get the viewers hyped up when Eren approaches Mali with all the Titans. However, after seeing him apologise to the kid, and seeing how disturbing and disgusting his actions were, you're meant to feel repulsed by Eren, questioning why you were even rooting for him in the first place. And that's something that I'll talk about later on in the video. That being said, this isn't the first time he's expressed this meta kind of relationship with Eren. He also mentions that Eren knowing the future and suffering because of it also reflects his own constraining relationship he has with writing Attack on Titan, having not changed the ending he's had in mind since the first chapter of the series that released all the way back in 2009. Now that's not to say that Isayama is a nihilist. In fact, he's very much quite the opposite. This isn't all he feels. Like everybody, he has numerous sides to him, and every character is a reflection of the author to a certain extent. Attack on Titan's main message to me, after all, is that the world is cruel, but at the same time very beautiful, which is something we see through Armin, Mikasa, and the rest of the scouts. All different aspects of Isayama, as he's previously mentioned. But Eren was simply the worst part of who he was, and it was for that reason he wanted to get rid of it. And when you add the context of Paradis being under oppression, the future being inevitable, and a million other atrocities, Isayama is able to express his desire and urge to wipe everything away in the most extreme and visceral way possible. So what does this mean for the viewer? Well, I go back to my earlier statement in the intro. It brings out the worst part of ourselves. I love to hail Isayama as a genius storyteller, but at the end of the day, he's only but a human. And anything he relates to is something that we, the audience, can also experience and relate to. Obviously, I hope none of you want to wipe out all of humanity, but I can definitely relate to him in my own way. The stress of university, just life in general, and a million other different stressful things. Sometimes I just want to erase it all out of existence. And that's why so many of us can sympathise and empathise with Eren's situation, even when it's clear to many of us that he's too far gone. I truly believe Cautionary main characters are unique in that these are really the only type of characters that can bring out these visceral and kind of dark emotions that lie within us to such an extreme extent. Their position in the story, real-time development, etc. is their beauty. But that being said, not everyone is able to see through this mask. And that brings me on to the next section of this video. But quickly before we get into the next section, I'd just like to say that I'd really appreciate if you can give this video a like. It helps get the video out to as many people as possible, and that would be very nice. Also, I try my best to post a video every 10 days. So if you would like to see more videos like this one, feel free to subscribe. I'd really appreciate it. Also, just in general, I appreciate you taking the time to watch this video. God bless, and let's get straight into the next section. Another common thing that all these characters seem to have in common is that they all have the perfect excuse to do something we'd normally consider bad. Something that they and some of the audience use to justify their actions. And a lot of the criticism I've seen for these characters stem from them arguing that sometimes these reasons seem a little too justifiable, negating the entire point of a cautionary tale. And with that I say, I completely disagree. I think it's actually the opposite. The more understandable it is, the more effective of a cautionary tale it becomes. It's actually genius. And I think the best way of illustrating this point is by looking at one of the most iconic cautionary characters of all time, Walter White. In the very first episode, we the audience are given the perfect excuse for why Walter goes and becomes a drug lord. Cancer. Not only does he comfortably pay for his treatment, but also when presented with an inevitable death, he needs a get-rich-quick scheme. Money to help his family. This comes off as altruistic. Yeah, we see him get annoyed that Hank is throwing him around, students disrespecting him, and a friend actively offering him money to help his family. But hey, who cares? They're all pricks. I'd probably feel the same way, right? At the end of the day, none of this really negates what seems to be his core and very understandable motivation. Money for his health and the future of his family. This creates a sense of empathy. We can justify his actions, and that's why throughout the majority of the story, we end up rooting for this guy. For a lot of people, that understanding we have for them develops into a fierce defense of all of their actions, rational or otherwise. But there's always a time in the story where that rooting needs to come to a halting stop. The further away I get from Breaking Bad, the less sympathy I have for Walter. He got thrown a lifeline early on, and if he had been a better human being, he would have swallowed his pride and taken the opportunity to treat his cancer with the money his former friends offered him. He goes out on his own terms, but he leaves a trail of destruction behind him. I focus on that more than I used to. When you take all of that into consideration, you wind up saying, why was I rooting for this guy? I think Vince's thoughts on Walter, post Breaking Bad, highlight perfectly the experience these characters are trying to provide the viewer. Rather than calling their initial reasoning a mask that slowly comes off, I think it'd be more accurate to say that it's a mask that slowly gets created by these characters as we get deeper into the narrative, only to get crushed at the end of the story. The evidence for this is that Walter doesn't stop. This cancer excuse may have been the trigger, but by the end of the story it clearly wasn't the real reason, it was his pride. And that's what the genius is here. Recontextualization. We rewatch previous scenes and we can see that from the very first minute where the flaw in his character was. A prominent example being the one that Vince mentioned, the idiocy of him not accepting help from his friend. But even after stating all of these examples and a different view of Walter post-ending from the very creator himself, it's still not enough to convince people on either side of the he was right or the story was too sympathetic for him category of fans. So it brings up the question, is this the author's fault? Do they have a responsibility to show us that these characters are absolutely and unequivocally wrong by having a video of them burning in the deepest despair of hell, suffering for all of eternity? Absolutely not. There's obviously a reason the author does this, to make the cautionary message more impactful. If it was a show where Walter was the straight villain, no excuse, he just wants money, then one, I think it'd be a pretty boring story, and two, the cautionary message would be a lot less impactful. Arguably even there, the only reason I'm able to question myself is because these courses seem justifiable, and that's why I say the more the merrier. Another example I'd like to give is the one I mentioned earlier in this video. When the Titans were approaching Marley, the music was playing, we were so hyped, we wanted to see Eren kill every single person on the island after seeing an innocent child who was also oppressed and who also wanted a better life for his family and friends get crushed. It makes us question, why was I rooting for this guy? Once again, the more these characters relate to the reader, the more impactful the message becomes when experiencing their downfall. We are warned that even if not to that extreme extent, we could easily end up like them, and that
must be better than this.
Well, if you're still not convinced yet, the author gives us a character right besides them that show us what the right thing to do is, the right path to go down, and that brings me on to the next section of this video. Now, in every cautionary character's story, there's always the character right beside him or beside her that is there to inspire others, the opposite of what a cautionary tale is. Now, the author uses these characters to specifically highlight the wrongdoings of the main character. This is usually different from your ideal villain versus hero clash, as it's given to us as a character in the exact same situation, but one that makes different decisions, and obviously leads to a different outcome. And I think the best way of understanding the depth and importance of these characters is by looking at some examples of how these two dynamics work. And for this video, I've decided that Light and L and Franklin and Leon highlight this perfectly. And I'd like to start this section off by looking at Light Yagami. The story of Death Note starts with a bored child whose world gets turned upside down after finding a Death Note where he then uses to try and change the world, only to ultimately fail at the end of the story. Even in that very surface level summary of what Death Note is about, you can see the flaw in Light's character. His boredom, or to make it sound even fancier, the lack of meaning in his life. Even before getting the death note, I wouldn't say Light was completely innocent. He wasn't your average happy high school kid. He was a child that seemed very detached to me. Lonely. He stands above his peers as somebody who's smart, handsome, physically gifted, and very popular. A man blessed in almost every regard, but it's because of that he's not really able to find any value in these things. Now that being said, when confronted with a book that can kill almost anybody in the world, a lot of people, no, actually most people would have probably thrown it away. Most likely because they'd be very scared of it, and also because they probably have a good moral conscience. But more than anything, because they have meaning elsewhere in their life. They don't need this. But before the viewer gets put with that question, an excuse is given. Light decides to use his power to create a positive impact on the world. The author adds complexity to this discussion, and it's what a lot of people use to justify Light's actions. So once again, is the author to blame for this? Absolutely not. Now, to explain this point, I can easily go down the route of just showing how Light becomes a very narcissistic psychopath by the end of the story, with a god complex that isn't real, but that's boring and it's probably been done 1,000 times. Instead, I'd like to look at his direct parallel, L. L, like Light, is very detached from society and is also unsatisfied with the world. But in the course of his battle, he's forced to show his face, interact with the police force directly, whilst engaging in genuinely one of the greatest mental battles of all time. But while Light becomes more and more hollow, we see something beautiful happen to L. Laureate builds a connection with the police force. And he starts to genuinely have fun with the people around him, and funnily enough, starts to build a bond with the very man who he's fighting, Light. But in the end he dies, failing to defeat Kira and being met with a grim smile as Light slowly starts to fade away from his eyes. So you're probably wondering, right? Huss, isn't this section about proving that the author is trying to show that Light Yagami is bad and he's meant to reward the good guy with a happy ending? And well, you're probably right. I was bullshitting this whole time. This is about showing that Light Yagami was right. If you see a criminal in any way, shape or form, even if he stole candy from the shop, kill him, kill him. After actually finishing the series, we see Laureate's life and his inevitable death in a much different light than when you originally saw it. Do you get it why I keep saying Light? Because Light Yagami, he's the main character and what I'm talking about, and that's meant to be the joke. Okay, forget it. L dies a noble death, and as much as I hate Nier, his will lives on, showing that his life had real world meaning, not to mention the implications of there being a heaven and hell in Death Note. L made an impact on the world. His life meant something, and his will lives on through people that he cares about. This was the harder path, the boring path, the whatever you want to call it path, but at the end of the day it was the right path. He always chose the harder option, and in the few years that he did live, he lived a much more fulfilling life than the hollow years that Light lived with his book. Light was handed an easy method on how to deal with the world, and it showed in his very flawed approach. These easy solutions come with a cost. Killing serial killers isn't enough, you have to move down to lesser criminals and lesser ones, and we reach the point where you are killing people that you can genuinely reform. And you see the implications of an individual holding so much power. He becomes even more detached from society, and therefore has no real connections with people around him. And when he gets broken, and when the god complex gets removed, we see how hollow he is, and how there was no real meaning in his life. Outside of the boring section post Light's death, and only focusing on Light's death, I thought Death Note had an absolutely brilliant conclusion. However, to this day we see people call this ending bad because Light went out sad, or he should have won, and I think it's a real shame that they're not letting his death impact them in any way, not letting the message reach them. That being said, I'll come back to the idea of messages and final says later in the video. Another example that I think shows this in a different light comes from Franklin and Leon. As in this situation, they weren't really enemies, they were friends. Now at the start of the story, we see that Franklin is genuinely an innocent kid. Somebody who made it out of his ghetto area, and is the only one that managed to thrive in his education, whilst Leon gets stuck behind. And even with all of that, they're still very close friends, best friends. That being said, Franklin gets his hands on a money-making method, crack cocaine, and he brings Leon and the rest of his family into it. And long story short, over the course of the next 5 seasons, we see Franklin and Leon destroy their own community, going from battling gangs to battling the FBI, the CIA, and ultimately infighting between his own family and friends. Now there are a lot of factors involved in destroying his community. The FBI and the CIA is obviously the biggest one, but Franklin and Leon were a huge part in helping them. But that being said, at the peak of the story, Leon travels to Africa, sees the world for what it is, finds pride in helping his own people, and wants to bring his community closer together, leaving his previous life for a greater purpose. Whilst Franklin loses his mind obsessed with money because of his greed, until ultimately we reach the final episode between a Leon who's become a very respectable young man and a Franklin that just looks like a shell of his former self. The creators don't have to do anything more to show you what type of message they want you to take away from this interaction.
You don't understand, yo. I ain't got no fucking chains on me, man.
And I hope this shows you the importance of having that parallel character. To me, it doesn't only serve as a beautiful storytelling method, but also serves as a method of strengthening the cautionary message presented in the story. But now that I've laid out all of this, I really want to get to the core of these characters. So what is it that continuously drives all of these characters to the same fate? Well, that brings me to one of my favorite concepts of all time, being a slave to yourself. So now we've reached the point in the video where I really want to talk about the core of these characters. What exactly drives them? And when thinking about this concept very deeply, there's only one word that really comes to mind: slaves. And I think the best way for you guys to kind of understand how I feel is by reading out one of my favorite quotes of all time. Kenny Ackerman's speech in Attack on Titan. In his last moments, he finally understood why he lived his life the way he did, why his friend lived his life the way he did. And I always found that to be so interesting. Sure, I don't want to die, and I want power, but, oh, I think I just got it. Why he did that. Every last person I've seen was the same way. Whether it was booze, woman, or even God. Family, the king, dreams, children, power. They couldn't keep going unless they were drunk on something. They were all slaves to something. Even him. These characters are slaves to their desires, this inability to let go of this bad part of themselves, which is exasperated by the excuse they get, is what leads to their downfall. Now that being said, when it comes to being drunk on something, there is no one who fits that description quite as literally as Bojack Horseman. His addiction to alcohol and drugs are much more than just a coping mechanism. It's indicative of his greatest flaw. The thing that he's a slave to, his self-centeredness. The existentialism of Kenny's speech can be taken optimistically as something that keeps you moving forward, as seen with Mikasa and Armin. But it can also be taken pessimistically, something that brings us down, something that ruins us. And in Bojack's case, is taken pessimistically as something that numbs his pain. Throughout the series, everyone around him tells him that his bad behavior cannot be excused by his troubled life. The opening credits of the show visualize the damage he does to the people around him, as he forces them along his destructive lifestyle before ultimately drowning as they watch helplessly, forced to deal with the trauma that he has inflicted on them and himself. Bojack is a character consumed by this self-centeredness, one who considers his own pain to be more significant than that of others. This comes to a head in the penultimate episode when he realizes that in his last moment he hurt Diane with his final messages, forcing her to once more stroke his ego and make him feel important by making her experience his pain. He refuses to acknowledge that others are struggling unless he could relate it back to his own pain, preferably through taking responsibility for it, whilst never striving to actually change. It's kind of ironic that Bojack's self-hatred is actually the most selfish part of himself. It's easier to wallow in your self-pity, get addicted to drugs, and drown in your own self-hatred than it is to actually take the time and effort to improve yourself and actually be a better person. Listen, of course everyone struggles and needs help, but Bojack was given that and much more. People who empathized and cared for him, opportunities to make amends and start anew. But that would require putting himself in a position that would make him uncomfortable, one that would not be familiar. It was laziness, it was ego. Everyone was happy once Bojack was out of their lives, not because he was damaged, after all everyone's damaged to a certain extent, right? But because he could not keep going unless he was at the center of everyone's life, at the center of everyone's attention. The opening theme that is associated with his LA lifestyle was played at the beginning of every episode, except for the one titled Escape from LA, in which he, after given a chance to find happiness with his friend and her family, refuses to take responsibility as an adult and takes advantage of her teenage daughter. And it was at this moment where I really thought Bojack was truly and utterly irredeemable. No amount of empathy or sympathy could ever justify that action. It was disgusting. He refuses to admit to himself that he was responsible and is promptly kicked out. The theme song playing as he makes his way back to LA. The accompanying visuals are not the familiar opening we know, but rather him drinking on his boat. He could never escape LA because he was LA. Sounds kinda corny, but I think it's the best way of describing Bojack. Now, I initially wasn't gonna talk about Bojack. I felt like he was a very hard character to talk about in general, but when I was talking about this idea of all cautionary characters embodying the slavery idea, my friend Chum went on a rant about how Bojack was the perfect person for this section, and after he explained it to me, I completely agree. Like, genuinely, Bojack is the embodiment of what a slave is, a slave to oneself, and with that, he did help me write this section. I'm gonna put all his links in the description. He wrote a much longer Bojack analysis, which I thought was amazing, so if anyone's interested in that, go check it out. Now, like I said earlier, not letting go of stuff isn't necessarily a bad thing, but there is a difference between having a desire and completely being controlled by one. Having a healthy relationship with a dream, for example, would be good, as long as you're not obsessed with it so much that it destroys everything around you. These characters sacrifice themselves to their desires, meaning that they eat away at themselves as they get further and further into the hole that their desires lead them down, going further and further and further into the abyss, until we finally see the author's destruction of these characters. And it's within this destruction and beyond the cautionary message presented that I think I managed to find something beautiful, and that's what I want to talk about in my final section. Now we've reached the end of their story. Their actions finally catch up to them and they can no longer look away from what they've done. We've reached the point in the story where they finally self-destruct. And honestly, one part that always manages to get me emotional is when these characters finally acknowledge the flaws in themselves. But at that point, it's always too late. There's no fixing what they've done. And in a way, all they can really do is see their path through to the end. Whether that means fixing whatever they still can, or simply accepting the fate that's given to them. Now, the cautionary aspect of these characters are very clear to see. The worst part of yourself, getting lost in an excuse, not acknowledging your own actions, the character beside them that chooses to do the right thing, getting drunk on your own desires. What's exactly being explored always varies, but these characters warn you that even if not to that extent, any one of us can easily become that bad. And it's when thinking about what these characters could have been that the cautionary message shines the brightest. Walter had a wife that loved him. He wasn't rich and he was just a teacher. He could have grown old with her, enjoyed the beautiful moments he had with his son and his newborn child, maybe even find value in being a teacher, like many do. But he only manages to realize this when he's a wanted criminal and there's no hope of going back. So all he can do is accept what he's done and try to fix what's left. Even Light, I felt like, had a moment of realization. Or a moment of acceptance. I don't know what to call it exactly. I'm cheating a little bit here because it is an anime only edition, but this moment of him on the stairs, slowly looking up at the light, feels to me like a sort of acceptance. Franklin became so lost in his own path, in his own society, that the only way he could ever be free of anything is by losing himself in alcohol and being just like his father. The only way that he's not chained up to his own desire. But you know what? I think there's something more here. Something along the lines of inspiring, but not quite exactly. And no, I don't mean becoming a mass murderer. And I think what it is exactly is that even after these characters have done absolutely horrible and irredeemable things, there's still a little bit of peace they can find. Some sort of comfort at the end of their lives. And I think to fully express this, I'd like to go full circle to the character I started off this video with. Eren Yeager. Eren was somebody that spent his entire life looking forward, and he kept moving in that direction, never turning around and appreciating what he had right in front of him. In a story about how the world is cruel and beautiful, he only saw one half of it, the cruelty. And just like Shardis said, he burned himself to the ground outside those walls. Once again, had he just turned around and acknowledged that alongside all of the cruelty that was in that world, that there was beauty, and so much of it, then maybe in the 4 years that he had left to live, he could have lived more than some people live in their entire life, fighting alongside his friends, and surrounded by the ones he loves. Instead, all he could do at the end of his life was try and salvage the horrible actions he committed into a somewhat sustainable future for them. But that being said, in his final moments, sitting in a pool of blood, he finally turned around and spoke to his friend Armin, and even after all the horrible crimes he committed, he found solace through Armin, saying that even if it's in hell, he won't abandon his friend. And Eren in his final moments saw the beauty that he'd been neglecting his entire life, in Mikasa smiling as she puts an end to his life. And it's in those final moments that Eren, who had been reduced to a monster and just a head, found some sort of peace. Call me crazy, but I think that is beautiful. A bizarre form of peace found by one in his last moments. These characters absolutely don't deserve it, but they still managed to have it in some way. Now, would this work in real life? Absolutely not, but that's the power of stories. I think it's kind of funny how I made an entire video about how these characters are a danger, a warning to you and society, and now I'm admitting that in some way there is inspiration you can find in them. That alongside a fat warning sign, there's a beautiful message to be taken away. That even the most horrible people and the worst scum of society can have some redeeming quality at the end of their lives. Just some. And I think after that entire explanation, we can see what the problem with these characters are when it comes to the audience. A lot of people end up focusing on the wider narrative, which I'm not going to sit here and say is necessarily a bad thing. You are engaging in a story and you do care about the overall structure, what a character's actions mean, what the narrative is building up to, etc. But I think if more people took the time to look at these individuals, how they lived their life, and what type of suffering it can lead to, I think you can take away a lot more from these characters and a lot more from these stories. That's about all I have to say. And yeah, if you have watched up until this point, once again, I really appreciate you. You know, I'm very new to writing video essays and making them, so I want to make it as engaging as possible. Also, I do try my best to upload a video once every 10 days, sometimes 14, but it is somewhere between 10 and 14. So if you are interested in that, feel free to subscribe. I'd really appreciate it. YouTube can be a very lonely place, and the only real kind of comfort, not comfort, but you know, love someone can get is by liking and subscribing and building a little community. So, you know, once again, I would really appreciate it. And if you did find some sort of newfound appreciation for these characters, you know, that makes me really happy. It means my video actually did something. Yeah, I'm waffling on a bit too much now. God bless. I hope you have a good day. You know, stay positive.